The way that I organized our sort of notes is, one, starting off with challenges in user research, particularly in Web3. And one sort of problem in this space is that not enough people are conducting user research. And user research is really a competitive advantage. It's really valuable if you start with user research before building or implementing it into your design process. So the difficulty is quantifying the value of user research. That's one difficulty. So you can have either qualitative research, in which you have discussions with users and conduct user interviews, or you can do usability testing, and that's sort of easier to quantify. And so we discussed a sort of typical user research workflow, which is really the best way to sort of get these responses and important information. So one is starting with a screener survey, which only needs to be about 4 or 5 questions. So you can send out a screener survey to a Discord or whatever communities you're tapped into and set some initial questions to filter out candidates for user interviews. So questions could include, how long have you been in this space? What sort of products do you use? That sort of thing. And then getting responses back, you can then filter out whatever you need to filter in order to qualify and who can proceed to user interviews. So user interviews really need to be, the ideal number of interviewees is really 5 to 10 people, and that's really all it needs to be. That was one key takeaway for me. I thought it needed to be much more than that, but 5 to 10 people is enough to get, the feedback and analyze that feedback and incorporate it into whatever your project is. Let's see, best practices for user research. One question I had myself was, how do you get people to talk to you in the first place? How do you find people to interview? And the answer to that is just to find them where they are. So in Web3, it's particularly easy because communities are online, they're on Discord, they're on your Telegram channels, they're at these conferences. And when you find, one thing that we did a little exercise where we did a sort of mock user interview about Telegram, for example. So we were talking about Telegram and the pain points that we were experiencing using Telegram. So one thing that's important to note is when someone has a real problem that they're passionate about expressing these specific high demand pain points, that would be a good person to interview when you find that person. Not necessarily going to look for that person, but when you come across people like that, definitely conduct those interviews. So some of our key takeaways, 5 to 10 interviewees is an ideal number for user research. One important thing is that stakeholders within your company, within your projects, your co-founders, your designers, every single stakeholder should be included at every step of the user research. And then Georgia mentioned it's the IKEA effect, right? People are passionate about what they build and when they're building it themselves. So it's important to include all stakeholders in user research. Progressive disclosure is another takeaway that we talked about. So not overwhelming the interviewee, the person that you're interviewing, with too much information, and sort of just allowing them to express whatever their viewpoints are. The solution, during our exercise with the Telegram, one thing that we learned, or I learned specifically, is that when you're conducting user interview, the solution doesn't happen during the interview. The solution happens afterward when you're analyzing, the feedback that you received from this interview. When you're looking for people to interview, one thing that we said is don't recruit the loudest person in your Discord for your user research, or if you do, sort of approach with caution. If I'm right, it's really sort of like the quiet sort of people who wouldn't necessarily use your product that you want to interview to get that valuable feedback. And last key takeaway is that user research is really a competitive advantage, and there needs to be more emphasis on user research and Web3 specifically, and also in general. And so our action point that we determined is that there really needs to be, there is a need for a public research repository in Web3 where people can share the data and these user interviews more broadly, and it just be better and for the ecosystem in general. So is there anything that you would like to add to that, or anybody would like to add to that?
Involved in this conversation or have more discussions around this topic, what would be the best way, maybe even within the next week in the co-work. Maybe we can have some discussions in the Discord and see where this kind of goes. Yeah. But like some of these threads around like sharing resources are going to come up in different groups as well, and then we can kind of collaborate and see where that goes. Maybe Sam, you want to share from your perspective? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, we had a fun, very wide-ranging discussion that I will struggle to synthesize now, but I'll do my best. So we kind of walked in with a very broad question of just like user onboarding and how do we make that better. And I think what we quickly realized is that in such a like generalized application platform like Ethereum, like user onboarding is very different depending on the use case and the product and what the user is trying to accomplish. So like trying to come up with a very broad, how do we improve onboarding for all these different projects and applications is like a pretty tricky question. But we started kind of just going round robin of like what are interesting topics within onboarding that we were interested in solving. Had some cool chats there. I feel like it got philosophical pretty quickly in terms of just like, well, we want to onboard people to Web3, like, what is Web3? And like, what are we trying to onboard people to? And it led to some really interesting questions, actually, of just like, you know, like, what are the core values we start with? What can we all agree on and align on as like a design and product community? And I'd say, in the whole, like, it left me with more questions than answers, but I think some action item ideas we came to was just like, okay, like getting aligned on what is Web3, right? Like what are we willing to compromise on from a product and design and like decentralization perspective? You kind of have to answer those questions before you decide how to onboard everyone onto that. So it kind of became a question of like, how do we onboard the onboarders of like, well, if we want to build products for these people, how do we align on principles to do that? How do we as designers and product people like actually learn how to do that? So I can already tell I'm getting away from myself here, but I think, yeah, it just became of like, okay, if this is a wide variety of different projects and applications and like even industries within Web3, like are there generalizable things that we can accomplish as a community? And I think like one simple one was just like consistent terminology. I think the like wallet presentation this morning was a great example of that, of like what shared infrastructure do we all inherit, right? Like we all choose the same protocol together. We all integrate with different wallets and applications, at least starting on a very foundational level, like how can we align on consistent reusable terminology? And I think building off of that, it was like, okay, well, what are consistent design patterns and like UI libraries that we can use that like a lot of the common flows across projects, how can we kind of share resources and open up that research similar to some of the user research they were just talking about? So I think that's one action item that hopefully some of us are going to look into. You know, testing and like actually comparing products we found is like actually very difficult in the Web3 space. Insight from my end, yeah, for a lot of designers, it's hard to just like see what other comparable products are out there and actually like use those products, because you don't want to have to pay $100 just to like test out a project just so you can see what the UX flow is like. So can we build sandbox environments where people can test these applications, where we can do product teardowns and share that as a community, and like try to learn from each other's mistakes and failures and successes along the way. So one action item within the group was kind of this like Mobin for Web3, if people are familiar with Mobin or Mobbin, of like basically, yeah, like tearing down flows, evaluating products, what do they do well, what do they do not so well, how can we kind of crowdsource that as a community. Another one came up was just, yeah, like, you know, Nielsen usability best practices. Can we, as a group, create a Web3 equivalent of just like, for all these, you know, general best practices on different product interactions, like what are comparable from the Web2 world, and like what kind of needs to be redefined or, you know, tested out as a group. Mel, do you have anything you'd like to add as scribe? Covered it in pieces?
I think you covered it, I'd say. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. So hopefully we keep jamming throughout the week. I know a bunch of us already in the Discord. We'll keep the conversation going. I think once we started peeling back the onion, yeah, it led to some really interesting philosophical questions, right? Of just, again, I think like with the risk of this industry and these terms being co-opted by others, like Web3, I think is, you know, it's a very new term. It's a very broad term. Encourage all you guys as like you go back to your projects about, yeah, like thinking about core principles, what compromises are we willing or not willing to make. Sometimes it's really easy to cut corners to improve UX and improve your conversion numbers, but, you know, at what cost does that come with? So again, I think most of us walked away with more questions than answers, but enjoyed the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you very much. You can pass it on to sign in with Ethereum.
All right. Hey, guys. I'm Sam. I was the scribe for the Sign In with Ethereum group. So we're going to do it a little differently. We have like kind of 3 takeaways. So first, I'm going to pass it to Lewis to talk about the first.
Thank you. Yeah, so I've hit the group directly with the use case that I have as a developer in a big video game company. Is signing with Ethereum is a nice thing. When you're building a new project, when you have a new product, you have a new sign-in option and you have your users. But what if you already have millions of players, of people that don't know anything about crypto, about blockchain, about NFTs, etc., and you want to onboard them, you want to have them use or create a Web3 identity, and also how you onboard the crypto-native user that want to join your platform, and also how do you merge these 2 user bases, because some people will have, like, they want to have at the end one identity. We want them to have one identity and share some information about their own identity and pass this information around between platforms and ecosystems. And signing with Ethereum is a very good solution opportunity for us. Signing as Web3, more generally, I would say. It could be also multi-chain, etc. And one of the big questions that we have is how do we do that when we have an existing user base? That was the first takeaway.
Cool. All right. So I guess our maybe second takeaway for Sign with Ethereum was, I guess when services use Sign with Ethereum, it's maybe like the first stage. Ultimately, you're giving up your data. Maybe there's some data that you want the service to have. What kind of data are you giving up, right? We realized in our work group that a data sharing workflow becomes necessary. Like, what permissions are you giving? Ideally, the user sets the data sharing policy, and this could get pretty complex, right? There are different kinds of data that maybe you want to share for different use cases in Web3. Maybe it's identity data, maybe it's transaction data, maybe it's assets you have. We were thinking about what could the UX look like, and we came up with maybe the idea of having these sharing defaults. So you could have like an intense privacy mode. We jokingly refer to it as psycho mode, where you really just like, I don't want anyone to have any information about me. I'm going to give them as little as possible. Maybe you have a normal mode where you're willing to give up like just normal things. And maybe you can have a full share mode where you really don't care. You're willing to share whatever you want, whatever anybody asks for. So we looked at, I guess we came up with like a little data sharing workflow, and we're really thinking about what the UI behind that looks like as well. So we have some pictures, which will be on the Notion, and also here. But additionally, I'll pass it off to Oliver to talk about some of the next stuff, and also our potential actions. Sorry.
Can you hear me through the mask? Yeah, I think it works. Yeah, so we also then ended up in a conversation on privacy. And you know, signing with Ethereum is primarily about signing in with your Ethereum account, your identifier. And I think what we identified is actually that sometimes it's actually quite beneficial if you use a different identifier for each service or dApp, but then you end up having issues with proving that you, for example, own an NFT on a certain different account than this. So we would need to have some sort of privacy-preserving technology that allows you to create a new identifier maybe for a service or for a dApp, while still being able to prove that you own NFTs or other attributes that are attributed to your previously established accounts, right? And that was basically one of the findings to include that. So I think from, give me just one sec to, yeah, and as a potential action item on this specifically, yeah, we will look into, I mean, we have, so in the ERP 4361, so the signing with Ethereum standard, we already outlined that in the future we'll look into those kind of things, and so it becomes just more prevalent that we will need to do it, and like just invest more research on what's the best way of achieving that. I mean, there are a couple of projects in our space that are already dealing with those things, and I think it's just basically do more research and understand better what data will be shared with dApps or services in general, and how you can get involved or participate in these conversations. So, you know, Signing with Ethereum is like a community initiative. We have a Discord. You can join the Discord and join the community calls that are hosted, I think bi-weekly or weekly. And yeah, that's basically it. And Sam, did I forget anything?
Maybe just some other takeaways. Is I guess like trying to figure out which data attributes are common to Web3. Wallets could be used for tons of stuff. How do we figure out what people need to share and make that kind of the default? Just from like a UI perspective, you're not trying to think about, unless you're an advanced user, you don't really need to know, or maybe you do need to know, but trying to figure out what the defaults are, basically, is like actually something that we don't know now. And so that's kind of a to-do. So with that, that's it for us.
Thank you. So there's 2 wallet groups. You can just pass it off to one of them, and then they can take it away.
Hello. So a group of us kind of headed downstairs to talk about the topic of multi-chain wallets, but we quickly split up into 2 groups. One group kind of focusing on the account composition and how multi-chain wallets can structure your key pairs, and the second group kind of focused on the transaction experience. But I'll let Ryan kind of talk about the group that he led on account composition first.
Yeah, so we sort of veered immediately off topic from multi-chain specifically into something that I think we determined was kind of at the core, which is recovery. Especially this question of if we were to assume that all wallets that are multi-chain are going to have a single recovery phrase at the root. And that might, whether or not we even want a recovery phrase, a single recovery method by which we generate this hierarchical deterministic wallet that contains a bunch of accounts. How do we determine how secure you should be from the get-go, right? And this comes back to this question, I think, of like, what are you intending to do with this wallet? Which probably ties into this question of onboarding. Like, what are some questions we can ask people up front? Because there may be, social recovery methods. There's a bunch of different factors that you could introduce to secure this wallet from the get-go. And it might be useful to have some kind of a heuristic or a common approach to getting a user started off on the right foot. Because later on, if you've done some activity, it's incredibly, there's a lot of complications in switching, migrating to another set of accounts. And an element of that we discussed was just this introduction of good friction, right? Like often we'll talk about removing friction from this whole process of setting up an account, setting up a new wallet. And there are a lot of places where there is friction that we do want to remove, but perhaps there is also like something to be said for keeping some good friction in the system, or even adding some more in certain cases if we think someone wants to like do something significant with this. For example, they have estate planning needs down the road. And then the other bit was settings, portability, and recovery. So we do talk about recovering the accounts themselves, but if you had many accounts in this wallet and you had labeled them, and then you imported them into another wallet, even if you have, say, MetaMask on desktop and MetaMask on mobile, now you're going to have to relabel everything. And that is confusing and inconvenient, and there's probably a role for settings migration format, and maybe even a way to put some of these settings in an encrypted fashion on chain, so that whenever a wallet imports it, especially if it was a multi-chain wallet, I want to derive these account paths again. Which chains should I look at? Which chains were you using? Those were probably the two big takeaways.
Cool. So the group that focused on the transaction experience side of the wallet kind of started by looking at the current state of the transaction experience in Web3. And like Ryan's group, we really quickly veered off the concept of dealing with multi-chain wallets and just kind of went down a bit of a rabbit hole that was like agnostic to that concept. We came up with a few challenges that kind of wallet client builders in the space need to work on. And those were kind of displaying the transaction payload in a coherent way so that the user can understand what the action they're about to do entails. Kind of focusing on also reducing the cognitive load on the user. Like users have to navigate features like bridging funds from one network to another, selecting the current network they're on, and kind of programming their wallet in advance of doing a transaction. That's a lot of effort for the user to kind of navigate prior to using an application. And then kind of more problems like how can we signal trust for the user? There's a lot of kind of scams and phishing sites out there, so how can a wallet aid the user in navigating this ecosystem and kind of being a little bit more safe? So we kind of noodled on these problems and realized that there's this really kind of challenging pattern where the wallet wants to introduce a really kind of nice, coherent user experience, but at the point where they want to show a nice bit of coherent information, the wallet needs to introduce a trust assumption to show that. And then now the surface area of information that can be misrepresented to the user is larger. So they might not be more safe, even though they have a more kind of coherent transaction experience. So we kind of realized that that's a pretty challenging problem. And we focused on how can we improve the transaction experience whilst keeping the number of trust assumptions that the user incurs kind of to the minimum. And projects like Khan's Sourceify are kind of really good at this because you can pull the thread and really verify the information down to the nth degree because it's decentralized. And then we kind of noodled on a few other examples like allow lists and deny lists for kind of detailing dApps that are endorsed or not endorsed by the URL. maybe a registry of contract audits where the contract has been audited and you can see who it was audited by. And then like standardized implementations of common contracts. So if you're kind of implementing an ERC20 contract in the same way that someone else is, you can kind of verify that that's true. So a lot of these solutions are like not necessarily at the wallet level and they're kind of middleware. And that probably speaks to the complexity of the problem that these solutions are like businesses in themselves. So to further this discussion, we can probably like continue the discussion in the Discord. And kind of advocate for including projects like Khan's in your project, so that I wasn't paid for this shill, but that's probably like the solution. So yeah, it's a tough one.
And then the one other I think thing to mention in the multi-chain space is the Chain Agnostic Standards Alliance will be meeting. What are the days, Boris?
Next Monday.
Next Monday. So for introducing new specs.
Awesome, thank you. So one question, do you guys kind of both veered off from the multi-chain stuff? Is it because you felt like there's underlying issues with the single chain wallets as a whole that you needed to solve before you even started thinking about multi-chain in the first place?
Yeah,
okay.
more or less.
Makes sense, makes sense.
Yeah.
So I guess no good multi-chain solutions coming anytime soon.
It's well, you know, someone could find one maybe, but you probably need a best practice implemented on one chain first.
For sure.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much, guys.